Hello everyone, this is Dr. Irby. This is going to be our second lecture looking at health as multi-dimensional. So I'll take you through the lecture and then I'll explain the assignment to get attendance credit for this particular lecture. So it'll be brief, but I do want to take you through a few things, especially to give you some context for the assignment. So let's take a look at the objectives for this lecture. So, by the end of this, you'll be able to describe the multi-dimensional nature of health, and then with that, you'll be able to differentiate between the various dimensions of health. A lot of different models out there, but I'll talk about one that I'd like to adopt for this class. And then lastly, you'll be able to identify requirements for the discussion board assignment. So let's jump right into it. I know we did talk about this a little bit last time, especially as we talked about the World Health Organization definition of health, but also the biopsychosocial model, which I'll mention a little bit about that again now. But for a long time in history, even into antiquity, health and human beings were seen as being multidimensional, mind, body, and spirit, and that was in various cultures. But for various reasons, as you read in the text, that became antiquated thinking. And so in 1946, the World Health Organization decided to adopt this as their definition of health, which is pretty comprehensive in nature and, as you can see, is multidimensional. So they define it as health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So you see two main components of this definition. Health is not just not being sick or not having a disease. It was thought that if you didn't have a disease or some type of sickness, then you were healthy. But it's more than that. It involves the physical domain, the mental domain, and the social domain. And as those are optimally functioning, then the person is said to be healthy. So again, this was adopted in 1946. The definition hasn't been changed since 1948. And reflects and is very similar to the biopsychosocial model, which we talked about last time. And of course, that was adopted in 1977. So there is this appreciation for and understanding of health as being multi-dimensional by various organizations and various physicians and so forth. So the model I'd like us to adopt for this class is this. You can see there are 5 components. I typically like to think of health as 4 components, but in this model they made a distinction between intellectual dimension and the emotional dimension, and I'll define each of these in a minute, but I like to think of those as the mental dimension. But then of course you have the physical dimension, you can see the spiritual dimension, I'll say a little bit more about that, and then the social dimension as well. So again, this is the model that I'd like for us to adopt for this class. So just to give you a little bit more, just to break it down. So physical, of course, deals with the bodily domain of health. So we're talking about the systems of the body. We're talking about the bones, the muscles, the immune system. We're talking about sleep, exercise, diet, so on and so forth. The social domain of health, which is really the interpersonal relationships that people have. That's the relational domain of health, so their connection with other people. And then intellectual domain, so the thinking domain of health, and then very closely connected to that is the emotional domain, the feeling domain of health, and then lastly the spiritual / metaphysical domain of health. So you see a lot in the literature about the spiritual domain of health, especially over the last few decades. Different researchers have decided to talk about the spiritual domain of health, accept it as part of health, and then talk about what it is. But I have some difficulty with calling it spiritual, partly because it is a borrowed idea from Judeo-Christianity in that way of thinking. I think that's a great way to think about it, but it's not exactly the same. I like to think of it as, or call it, the metaphysical domain of health. but we'll call it the spiritual domain of health for this class, and specifically think about it as a person's sense of purpose and meaning in life. A lot of the research and a lot of the definitions that you see out there from a health perspective also incorporate a person's sense of connectedness, which sounds like the social domain, but it goes beyond just a person's connection with other people. It's talked about as having a connection with a higher power or some being outside of the physical domain, and then a person's sense of connection with themselves, Mother Nature or nature, things around them, so on and so forth. But those are the dimensions that we're going to think of and talk about for this class, and so that's a little bit more about those specific definitions. So with that kind of thinking in mind, I'd like you to complete this assignment. So in this module, I posted the Vanderweel 2017 article. It's not a very lengthy article, but it's very interesting in terms of the author's perspective on what it means to flourish. So we're thinking about health and well-being, but we're thinking a little bit beyond that in terms of what does it take for human beings to flourish, and what does that look like? How can we define that? Of course, there's different facets of that, there's different dimensions of that, and so I think the article does a really good job in continuing that discussion. It's been a discussion that's been happening for quite a long time, but I think the article does a nice job highlighting it. So read that article, check it out. Again, have the frame of mind as thinking about health as multidimensional. And then I want you to answer the following questions in the discussion board posted in this module. So you can just answer the questions. You don't have to comment on other people's comments or posts. You can if you'd like, but I at least want you to answer these questions. So of the 4 pathways to flourishing, so the article talks about 4, which one seems to have the greatest impact on people? Of course, this is completely an opinion response. There's no right or wrong answer to this, but what is your opinion on this? But I want you to support that opinion with research described in the paper. So with each pathway to flourishing, the article talks about some research that supports that, and then I'd like you to support that also with a personal example, so something from your own life or something that you've observed in somebody that you know. And then lastly, thinking about the pathway you selected, describe how this particular pathway, along with at least 3 domains, you're going to see there's 4 pathways and then 6 domains that the article talks about, but you're going to just select 3 to talk about, how those things will play a role in the work you plan to do in the future. So thinking about your career, thinking about your life down the line, how are these things going to play a role in the work that you decide to do? So that's it for this lecture. That's the assignment. Enjoy it. I look forward to reading your posts and then talking about it in our next class. So remember, we're not meeting on Labor Day. Happy Labor Day. I believe that's September 2nd. But we'll come back together on Thursday, September 5th for class that day. So again, have a great time with this assignment, and have a great Labor Day, and I'll see you on Thursday.